Thomas Miller was an ordinary man living in the heart of Texas. 54 years old, the father of 3 adult children, a widower, worked as a night guard in the old building of the St. James Psychiatric Hospital, which had not been used for its intended purpose for a long time. The building has been empty for almost 30 years, but for some reason, it has not yet been destroyed. Thomas himself believed that this was not so much a strange place as a gloomy one. Walls forever soaked with tragedies and pain that could not be erased. But despite these feelings, the work here was quiet and relatively calm. However, in the last few weeks, things have started to change. At first, strange sounds appeared. They echoed hollowly through the long, dark corridors, that faint scratching as if someone was walking, slowly, step by step, not showing up in the field of view of the cameras, but clearly present nearby. Every time Thomas came on his night shift, his heart told him that it wasn't just the wind. The feeling of anxiety became so powerful that he had to always carry a flashlight, although he usually did not even go out on rounds with it, since both the cameras and most of the corridors were well lit. These sounds were quickly supplemented by a new, much more alarming phenomenon. Soon, at night, on the monitors, Thomas began to notice strange figures that flashed at the far end of the hall or in doorways, seemingly right on the edge of his field of vision. In addition, every time he tried to call the police or just talk to someone about it, the authorities seemed to dismiss it as fatigue or imagination. And yet it wasn't imagination. During one of the shifts, Thomas noticed that someone had thrown his work magazine off the table. Then the marks of someone else's hands remained on the windows, and the rustles crept closer and closer to his workplace. When one night he noticed a clear silhouette on one of the camera screens, Thomas decided not to ignore what was happening anymore. The recording showed a figure, tall, thin, with long arms and a faceless face like a human shadow. Thomas felt a twinge of inexplicable terror. Finally, he decided to leave his post and went to explore the building himself. When he walked through several corridors, a loud knock sounded in the silence. It was the sound of a door closing in his office, far behind him. The light of the flashlight picked out only a narrow circle, and outside of this circle, Thomas felt as if the walls were moving, compressing his space. As he moved on, the darkness around him became thicker, and the air became suffocating, as if in a basement where fresh air had not been supplied for a long time. The corridors became narrower and more confusing, turning into a maze, although Thomas knew perfectly well that there were no such dead-end corridors on the hospital plan. At one of the intersections, he heard scratching again. It was so loud this time that it seemed to come from the floor directly below him. Thomas stopped and froze, staring into total darkness, feeling cold sweat slowly trickle down his forehead. Suddenly, his flashlight began to blink, creating ominous flashes of light, and in one of these flashes, at a distance of only a few meters from him, he saw this creature. The creature was standing right in the middle of the corridor, its long arms outstretched towards Thomas. He had no face, as in the footage from the cameras, and this lack of features was much more frightening than if he had seen a distorted face. Thomas, paralyzed by terror, slowly began to step back, but at that moment his flashlight went out completely. He remained in total darkness, listening to the silence being broken by footsteps coming closer and closer to him. When panic seized him, Thomas ran away. Running as fast as his legs would allow, without looking back and feeling something cold and alien pulling him deeper into the maze. He didn't even know which way the exit was. He just kept moving forward until he started to get tired. Soon, at one of the turns, he saw a barely noticeable illuminated sign, "Exit." But the closer he got to her, the further she moved away. When he was almost exhausted, the corridor abruptly ended in a dead end. When Thomas stopped in front of him, he realized that he was trapped. Footsteps sounded behind him again, and at that moment, fear and terror reached their peak. Thomas turned around, but saw nothing. Suddenly, in total darkness, he heard a familiar rustle, the same one that had been following him on the monitors, but this time it came from the wall, as if something was pulling through it. And then the walls, as if responding to his fears, began to close. Thomas backed away, pressing his back against the cold wall of the cul-de-sac, feeling the space around him getting tighter by the second. It seemed that the walls began to move, slowly shifting towards each other, and the air thickened, as if the corridor itself was coming to life, trying to absorb it. The currents of fear held him down, paralyzing him, but the instinct of survival forced him to fight. Suddenly, he noticed a barely noticeable crack in one of the side walls. It looked too narrow for a human, but Thomas knew he wouldn't get another chance. He strained with all his strength, crawling through it, feeling the rough surface of the wall scratch his skin. Squeezing inside, he found himself in a completely dark but spacious room. It was some kind of old ward ruined, with mold on the walls and broken windows. There were traces of old, dried blood on the floor, and some scraps of paper and medical instruments were scattered in the corners. Thomas felt the cold breath of death permeating every corner of the room. But as soon as he turned around, he realized that he had reached a dead end. Only one window seemed to be open, and he quickly went to it to see if it was possible to get out through it. Peering into the night darkness outside the window, Thomas suddenly noticed someone's shadow standing motionless below. The creature, the faceless one, stretched out its long arms to the window, as if inviting Thomas to come out to him. Thomas knew he had nowhere to go. It was impossible to go back to the corridor, and even more so to stay in this room. He heard that eerie rustle again, this time very close, as if someone was crawling on the floor behind him. Looking back, he saw that something similar to a human body was crawling towards him, but devoid of features and skin, covered with dark spots and with distorted limbs. Without hesitating for a second, Thomas rushed to the door on the opposite wall, and surprisingly it opened, letting him out into another corridor. But this corridor was different. The walls were covered with strange markings, resembling indistinct human handprints. It seemed like someone was trying to get out of here, leaving footprints on the walls until they disappeared into this place. Thomas walked down the corridor, feeling as if something unknown was following him out of the darkness. His pulse was echoing in his ears, his footsteps were getting faster, and suddenly he saw the exit sign again. This time it burned brighter than before. Driven by fear and despair, Thomas rushed towards her. It seemed like this was his last chance to escape. Thomas ran out to the door, which was marked exit. He clutched the cold metal handle, ready to run outside, breathe in the fresh air, and escape from this nightmare. However, the door was locked. He forcefully yanked it several times, but it wouldn't budge, as if it was blocked from the inside. Thomas looked around, confused. His legs were weak from fatigue, and there was not enough air in his lungs. The pounding of his heart was so loud that it seemed he could even wake up the walls of this old building. In desperation, he noticed an old rusty lock on the door. Running up to him, he took out a bunch of keys that had been given to him at the post. Turning over one by one, Thomas blindly tried to find the right key. After agonizing seconds, the lock finally gave way. He opened it with difficulty, and the door, with a terrible creak, began to open. But instead of the long-awaited exit to the street, he found himself in a long, musty basement with a concrete floor. There were decomposed wooden boxes in the corners covered with a layer of dust. It seemed like an old storage room, forgotten even by those who tried to keep order in an abandoned hospital. But the only thing left for him was to move forward. The basement smelled damp and musty, and the smell made him sick. But he had no choice. He walked quickly forward, lighting the way with a flashlight. The flashlight's battery was almost running out, and he knew that it wouldn't last long. Moving along the aisles, Thomas noticed that he was surrounded not only by boxes and boxes, but also by strange objects. Broken chairs, broken medical instruments, drops of dried blood on the floor. Soon he came across an archive cabinet left in this corner, and decided to check it, hoping to find something that could help get out. Opening one of the drawers, he saw folders with records containing patient lists and reports. He noticed the name on one of the documents, Miller. His heart skipped a beat. That was his last name, but why is she here? He delved into the folder and realized that there were records of patients with a similar surname, including descriptions of their diagnoses and medical histories. They were all placed here at the insistence of the same family who once lived nearby. Thomas didn't know how to take it. It seemed too strange a coincidence, but he didn't have time to think. He He dropped the folders and ran down the hall. But he heard the sound of footsteps. This time it was not a rustle or a muffled knock, but clear footsteps that sounded closer and closer. Thomas pressed himself against the wall, his heart pounding. It seemed to him that someone was purposefully walking towards him. In the light of a dim lantern, he made out the silhouette of a man walking slowly down the corridor towards him without making a sound. It was a man in a work uniform, covered in dirt and dust. Thomas held up the flashlight, illuminating his face. The stranger looked strange, as if he had been locked in this place for a long time. His eyes were full of fear and burnout, and his lips were cracked from dryness. "Are you stuck here too?" The man spoke with difficulty. His voice was hoarse and weak, as if he had not spoken for many years. Thomas didn't know what to say. He just nodded. "I also worked here," the man muttered, wiping sweat from his forehead. "I was trying to find a way out. This place, it's..." The man fell silent, looking around as if he was afraid that someone would overhear him. Thomas felt a chill run down his spine. The man continued, "I checked every corridor, every door. Everything here is strange. It's like the hospital has no end." Thomas was barely aware of what he had heard. "My head was buzzing, my thoughts were confused." The stranger's words, like an echo of his own fears, made him feel hopeless, but he knew that he couldn't just give up. He exhaled, trying to control his despair, and said softly but firmly, "We'll get out of here. Together." The man nodded, clearly clinging to Thomas's words as his last hope. They agreed to move through the basement and inspect every corner, every door, until they found a way out. Walking slowly, they shone their lanterns in different directions, feeling the oppressive silence, interrupted only by their quiet footsteps and rare breathing. After wandering around the basement for many minutes, they finally came across an old staircase leading up. As Thomas climbed it, he noticed a faint glimmer of light through the dirty windows on the top floor. Hope sparked in his soul, and he, filled with confidence, ran to the window, leaving the man behind. For a moment, it seemed to him that he had come out of this maze. He pressed himself against the cold glass and saw glimpses of morning light. It was a sign that they might be close to the exit. However, as soon as he turned around, he realized that the stranger had disappeared. Thomas rushed out of the room in disbelief and rushed to look for him. And suddenly, behind one of the corners, he heard heavy breathing. Running closer, he saw that the man was leaning over, holding an old, dusty folder with papers in his hands. Looking at them, Thomas saw a familiar name. It was his own name, Thomas Miller. With shaking hands, he took the folder and began to read. There were records of the death of one Thomas Miller, a former guard at this hospital, who allegedly died after getting lost in the building's basements during a night shift 20 years ago. He felt dizzy. He couldn't believe what he was reading. The stranger's hand fell on his shoulder. He said in a barely audible voice, "We're not the first to be stuck here, Thomas. You know what this place means." Terrified, he stepped back, but the man only squeezed his shoulder harder. "No one's coming out, Thomas. No one gets out of this damn place." Realizing that his attempts to survive were in vain, he felt a chill of fear squeeze his heart. Thomas closed his eyes, clenched his fists, and still tried to pull away. But the walls, as if alive, began to slowly shrink around him, and at the last moment he realized that he would always remain here, just one of the shadows wandering the corridors of the hospital. When morning came, other employees found an empty security post and a monitor turned on, which showed movement in an empty corridor.